In tonight's episode, we cover 5 hair-raising encounters with Bigfoot, Sasquatch, and what others believe to be some wild beast in the wilderness. From footprints found in the wintertime to having rocks and logs thrown at you, let the encounters begin. Story 1. Born and raised in Oklahoma, and have been my whole life. I grew up fishing, tracking, everything you could possibly want to do in the outdoors. My entire family is that way, and I raise my boys the same way. However, I've never been one to believe in all of the silly fairy tales that people spew about Bigfoot and other silly animals that live in the woods and apparently exist. Until one day, me and my oldest son had a strange encounter when we went to go fishing at one of our local creeks we like to frequent. It was a beautiful sunny day in June of '99, and we thought we'd make a good day of it and go pack some food and have a good day fishing, just father and son. Well, we got everything loaded up and got the tackle box and our poles and headed out. The creek we were heading to is roughly about 20 minutes away from our house, since we kind of live a little bit out of town. When we got to the creek, all seemed well and lively. The water was rushing pretty quick. Even though it was June, the stream was still ice cold, which is always great to stick your feet into just after getting there and you've been walking around and it's very hot. This particular spot, it's a pretty typical creek bed, but there is a lot of bushes and brush scattered throughout the area, and I'm talking tall bushes that are like 6 to 7 feet tall. It's definitely not clear and open, so you have to kind of find a nice spot along the riverbank to fish. We found a nice spot to sit down, and we began to unpack our food and get our tackle box and poles all set up. As I'm sitting there helping my son, I noticed my son's attention is not on what we're doing. Instead, he's looking over my shoulder with the most confused look on his face, seeming quite distracted. I thought that was pretty odd since my son's favorite pastime is fishing, and I never lose his attention to anything other than fishing. So I turned my head to see what he's looking at, and I think maybe it's a bear or something, but I was wrong. About 30 feet away, behind a 5-foot bush, was this face peeking out, staring at both of us. It looked humanoid, but also had a very Neanderthal-like quality to it, with hair all around it, and more of a cone-shaped kind of head. The cheeks were bare, and the skin looked very leathery, but there was hair all over the face. The eyes were dark, and I couldn't really make out any pupils. Its nose was like ours, not like a gorilla's. I wasn't really sure what it was at first. Once it realized both of us were staring at it, it immediately popped its head back down. My son starts freaking out, wondering what on earth it was looking at us. I was starting to freak out a little bit too, but I just wanted to chalk it up to somebody playing a cheap trick on us with some sort of stupid Hollywood mask. So I yelled out, "Whoever you are, leave now. I have a gun on me." And this thing, faster than I could have ever imagined, bolted out from behind this bush into the woodline about another 70 to 80 feet. Now, I want to remind you that this is total daylight, so we're able to see everything pretty clearly. This thing was about 5 to 6 feet tall and pretty hairy. I mean, I'm talking full black hair. If a black bear could be walking on 2 legs and running like a human could, you would pretty much be nailing it, except for the cone-shaped head and no neck. It didn't really look like it had much of a neck, and its arms swayed back and forth. It was also very barrel body shaped and built like a tank. It never looked back as it ran, and I've never seen anyone or anything run so fast. As soon as it hit the woodline, it disappeared. My son, for the rest of the day, kept wondering what on earth it was that we saw. I told him that we would talk about it later, and to try and just enjoy our fishing trip. Well, we didn't really fish there for long before he was just too uncomfortable, and so we left to go back home. On the drive home, My son is in a stupor and he asks me, "Did we see a Bigfoot?" I told him that Bigfoot isn't real and it must have just been somebody trying to pull a prank on us. Looking back, I was really naive to think that. I've told this encounter to a couple of friends of mine who are Bigfoot enthusiasts, and they informed me that what I probably experienced was a juvenile Bigfoot, since it appeared a lot more curious and playful than it ever did territorial or aggressive in any way. I'm not really freaked out now, but whatever it was very strange. I felt weird for me and my son seeing what it was. Now that my son is all grown up, he still goes fishing in that exact same spot, but we've never really talked about the experience since, and I've never brought it back up. Story 2. This is a story that my grandfather had told me back from when he was younger. He's had property in his generation for a long time, and him and his father used to hunt on their property out in Texas. As of currently, our family had moved to Minnesota, and that is where we've been currently residing for a long time. We actually don't even visit the old property anymore, and haven't in ages. My grandfather has been hunting since he was just a boy, and so he's a fairly experienced woodsman who doesn't really ever fear much. It still gives me chills to this day to hear this encounter, because my grandfather still gets shaken up every time he recounts it. My grandfather hunted all sorts of game, deer, coyotes, squirrels, you name it. They had a lot of property to work with, so he had a lot of time on his hands to really learn the woods around him and get a good feel for the game in the area. There's even wild turkey that would run around there from time to time, so there was plenty to hunt all season long. This particular day ended with him taking a route that he didn't normally take to venture out to a different part of the property that he wasn't used to. Him and his father had several different routes they would take on their property to go venture off and different spots to go hunt. After making it maybe a mile is when he started to hear strange vocalizations and other bizarre noises in the woods around him. At first, he told me he thought it was a bird, but he said there's no birds in the woods that sound like these noises did. They would come and go, so he kinda wrote them off at first, but they started getting louder and more frequent. But he kept venturing further because my grandfather isn't afraid of anything. After venturing maybe another mile is when he started to get hit with a very strong skunk musk odor that was said to smell like rotting meat and skunk. My grandfather described it like coming upon a pile of 100 dead rotting skunks just sitting in the sun and baking. He said it was so strong there'd be times it was hard not to want to gag and vomit. He said he kept looking around but didn't see anything, but started to get the overwhelming feeling that he was being watched. At this point, he knew something was up. He couldn't find the trace of the smell, and things were getting more eerie as time went on. He also told me that as he ventured around the area, there were times where he would run into stuff that didn't quite look right, like markers that weren't quite man-made, is what he said, like they might have been markings from animals or something. He told me about how he found smaller trees that were ripped up out of the ground and turned upside down and pulled back into the ground. What's scary is this is back in the 1940s, and their property was pretty large, as well as being private, so nobody was going to be hanging out on their property doing anything like this. And if so, who's going to rip up all these small trees out of the ground? And who's going to have enough strength to drive them back into the ground? This was really unsettling. My grandfather also believes he stumbled upon a small den of whatever it was he was smelling. He said he also found a small cave opening that opened up into a cave that he estimated to be roughly 30 square feet. But the stench of the dead skunk smell was where it was coming from. He also said he could see bones just from the cave entrance alone, and decided it was probably a good idea to head back home. Although they were the bones of deer from what he gathered, he didn't want to take any chances. He told me that as he was leaving the den, he started to get an extremely overwhelming feeling of dread and felt the need to get the hell out of there. That's when he noticed rocks starting to be thrown in his direction. And I'm not talking about little pebbles. I'm talking rocks the size of a tire literally being thrown through the woods about 10 to 20 feet near him. This was obviously enough, so he was so scared he booked it out of there and got back home as fast as he could. He said whatever was throwing those rocks at him had to be incredibly strong and obviously not a human. He said there was some sort of stomping and screaming noises that were going on as soon as he was leaving the den. Something was trying to drive him out of the area, and whatever it was close by. He tells me there were multiple of these things, not even 50 feet away, but he couldn't see them. After that, he still continues to hunt on his property, but not near as much as he used to, and he never went beyond where he went before. He continued to stay in new areas. His father never said much about it, and I guess there was never really a whole lot to discuss, since back then especially, you'd be practically crazy if you ever brought it up. The property ended up getting passed down to him once his father died, and not long after that, he moved to Minnesota due to his career. Story 3. My fiance and I love camping and always do stuff in the outdoors. We're usually pretty avid hikers and explorers. We've gone through many different trails, hikes, and many adventures out in the woods. I've never noticed anything out of the ordinary or even out of place, although I am a firm believer in the paranormal and Bigfoot and other weird occurrences that do happen, although I've never really experienced them until this particular event that I'm about to talk to you about. Me and my fiance decided to camp at one of our favorite lakes, Lake Dewey in Michigan. We've camped here several times before and have always had a great experience, so this time would be no different, or so we thought. It was later September, and I remember because it was still pretty warm, but the cold crisp in the air of fall had not yet set in. We had a pretty typical fun day on the lake. We hung out, we hiked, we hung out in our tent before going back out and hiking again, and then coming back for dinner to relax for the evening. But by the end of the first night, my boyfriend was acting strange. He was getting really quiet and not talking as much as he normally does, which I just chalked it up to him being exhausted, since we did had a long day. We ended up putting out the fire and turning in for the night. I noticed he seemed on edge and had a rough time falling asleep, but he didn't mention anything, even when I asked him if he was okay. I sacked right out and woke up the next morning no problems, feeling well rested and ready to take on the next day. Him, not so much. He didn't look so good and seemed like he was still on edge from yesterday. After getting up and eating breakfast and going on the next hike, the day seemed pretty normal, and we decided to get ready to go back to camp as it was starting to become later in the afternoon. That's when he set me down and told me that he had been feeling uncomfortable since yesterday. When I asked him what was wrong, he just said he didn't feel right about where we were, and that he felt like we were being looked at and watched very closely. I assured him that he was just paranoid, and it was silly to think like that. Nothing was out here. Nothing was going to get us. I convinced him to stay with me another night, but he seemed so apprehensive about it. Now, it was bothering me how weird he was acting, because it's not like him. Usually, he's one of those guys that is the first to come up with crazy hiking trails and spots for us to check out. He was always the first one of us to want to explore dangerous territory and stuff that were never meant to be explored. This night was a little calmer, and I feel like we both checked in a little earlier than normal. I ended up staying up and dinking around on my cell phone while my boyfriend just lay there trying to fall asleep. The evening had been pretty dead. We hadn't really talked a whole lot after heading back to camp. It was just kind of blah. After he sat me down and told me what he did earlier, I had been kind of on edge, but just tried to play it off. It was pretty late at night if I remember right. I want to say my phone said something like 11:32, and this is where we started to hear footsteps go through our campsite. And I mean heavy footsteps. And then the breathing started. I started to feel really uneasy, and I just kept hearing a thud for every step that was taken. I started to panic because I wasn't sure if this was a bear we were dealing with or someone who was trying to hurt us. I looked over to my boyfriend and asked him if he heard what I was hearing, and he was already as white as a ghost and nodded right at me. I sat there scared, looking at the door of my tent, trying to listen for any sound I could. The sound had ceased for a while, and all I heard was the night air. The stomping would stop for a couple of moments, and then it would resume. Whatever it was stomping around in circles around our tent, but it wasn't really getting into any of our stuff like a bear would. It's like it was casing our tent or something. It made me feel so nervous. Whatever it was kept getting really close to the tent, and we could hear it breathing heavily. It must have been huge because it sounded like it was a 10-foot tall man. Either that, or it was a bison on 2 legs walking around our campsite. For the next few hours, this would go on and off until roughly 3 or 4 in the morning, and we could finally fall asleep. We didn't even notice the noises stopping, and the feeling of dread went away. I think my boyfriend and I fell asleep from just sheer exhaustion and panic. We still do not talk about it to this day, and when we got up the next morning, we didn't even speak. We just booked it out of there and packed up as quickly as we could. Could it have been a Bigfoot from what we saw or heard? Probably. Could it have been someone rummaging through our camp? I don't know. Whatever it was, I don't think I'll ever go back to that lake. Story 4. Me and my brother Travis have been going out hunting together for as long as I can remember. Back when my pa, God rest his soul, used to take us when we were little, he always told us how impressed he was because of how quickly we were able to catch on and learn about the area around us and things we would notice like tracks, markings, sounds. It was great. We didn't actually start going hunting though with him until we were a little older, around 9 or 10, and we instantly fell in love with it. Our pa passed away from cancer when we were roughly about 17 and 16 respectively, since my little brother is only about a year and a half younger than I, and it just quite hasn't been the same since. So, to honor that, me and my brother make it a ritual to try and go out together every year and hunt and keep it going. The family line depends on it. Our uncle has had some property that has been passed down for quite a few generations that me and my brother and pa have hunted on for ages. These past 5 years specifically though, we had been going to different places to hunt, and it just wasn't quite the same as our uncle's property. So this year we had decided we were going to go back to our uncle's and give it a go. We contacted him and got the okay, and we'd shown up there in the early morning. Luckily for us, there's several different tree stands set up all throughout my uncle's property. He's got about 80 plus acres of just deep woods. We are in Montana after all, and a really, really nice cabin-styled house that we sometimes like to sleep in when we visit before we go out camping. Anyway, we knew this time the usual tree stands we wanted to hit. We got there that early morning and got all geared up and ready to go. It was clear my brother was going to take a stand about a half mile away from the stand I was in. We were both going to go in about 2 to 3 miles deep into the woods to get to this one specific spot we both knew of. It was actually a pretty good clearing, and there are many bucks and does that were usually sighted here, so we knew this was the prime spot. We got all ready and headed out to the designated spots we needed to go. I wished my brother luck, and he did to me as well. I climbed up into my tree stand once I made it and sat there and I waited. Usually, when I get to my tree stand, it's hard for me to not want to get totally relaxed and just be comfortable. I love it. I love it being out in nature and hunting. That's where I belong, and I've always felt so at peace. The sunlight was barely breaking through. It couldn't have been any later than 5 or 6 in the morning. I don't remember exactly. I thought it was weird though that I didn't notice any wildlife really teeming in the area as we had made our hike back to these stands. I didn't think anything of it at the time though. An hour had gone by and nothing. The woods were so unusually quiet, and all the life in it was gone. I mean, there wasn't a sign of anything around. I thought it was so odd. It wasn't long after that that I started hearing weird noises coming through the woods. I couldn't really place a direction around me to where it was coming from. I just knew it was coming around me from close by. I just figured at first that it was a big buck finally coming through the area since it sounded so heavy. I kept hearing brush crushing and twigs snapping. The only issue is the heavy thudding and footsteps I was hearing didn't sound like it was coming from a 4-footed animal. It sounded like it was a heavy person, but it sounded way too heavy to be a person. I started to hear what I can only describe as whooping-like noises and other strange sounds. I started to get nervous. The sounds began getting louder and louder, and as I looked out of my tree stand to see if I could spot what it was, I locked eyes on it. Coming into the woods from the clearing not even 50 yards away from me was this giant hairy man. I quickly ducked my head down to make sure it didn't see me, and every step it took was a deep thud, and I could hear it wheezing and breathing hard. I heard it walk its way towards me, and then as it approached my stand and got close, it slowed down. I was so terrified I wasn't sure what to do. I gripped my rifle tightly, praying I wouldn't have to use it in this confrontation because I knew I wouldn't make it standing out against this thing. It slowly passed underneath me and kept on going. I waited for it to be gone completely before I even moved a muscle. It felt like an eternity. I quickly opened the hatch and got down out of my stand, and by instinct, I ran to my brother's stand where I knew he'd be. Only being half a mile away, I knew it wouldn't be too far, and if I can get past the thing that walked right under my stand, I would probably be okay. The woods were still quiet, which made me so nervous because that means it was still in the area. I made it to my brother's stand in probably 10 minutes, or even less. He was also as pale as a ghost. I explained to him what had happened, and he didn't really say much. He just said we needed to leave, and so we hightailed it out of there. I've been hunting for years and years, and I've never seen anything or encountered anything like I did that morning. It wasn't until we got back to the truck that my brother was telling me he saw the same thing walking near his tree stand, and that he doesn't believe this creature saw him or even meant any harm. He's probably right, but it's something that I don't want to have happen ever again. It honestly scared me to death, and I haven't been able to go back to my uncle's property and hunt since. My brother was able to get over it and move on, but he will never talk about it. And since then, we found other areas and places to hunt on. I think we've kind of just collectively have decided to not go back, even if it is kind of an unspoken rule. Whatever's running around on my uncle's property, keep it far away from me. Story 5. When I was in my early 20s, I loved going out in the wintertime and exploring as much as I could. It was my favorite season to go out and hike in. Everything was so magical, and even though it was cold, the temperature and climates never pushed me away. Even though most people never went outdoors in that time, I always dressed accordingly. My favorite thing would be to go down old abandoned logging roads and just pull off and start exploring. Usually, those are the best parts because so much of those woods around there are untouched. Of course, I like to really go and explore just about every season there is, but winter is just so unique. I'm not really a hunter by trade or a woodsman. I just like to hike and explore. But I do have many good friends that are avid outdoorsmen and hunters. Now, there is always something to see and explore, no matter really what season you're in. I often take weapons with me, like elephant knives and the such, just in case I would run into a bear or a mountain lion or anything that would put me in a bad situation. In this particular time, as I was exploring the area around, I came across what appeared to be extremely large tracks down by this little frozen river a few miles into the woods. I've always been pretty neutral about the whole Bigfoot phenomena, but this was amazing to witness firsthand. I don't know if really anybody else comes out this way, and if they do, I seriously doubt they're going to bring a fake foot imprint on the ground. This was a dried up old creek bed that looked like it had been not used for a long time, like maybe it had dried up years and years ago, because the footprints looked like they had been old and frozen. I think what really got me was the overall impression of the footprint. You could tell it was set pretty deep into the frozen ground. Now, these footprints weren't exactly in the snow, more so in an area where the snow was receding and the ground was still totally frozen, and it looked like the footprints had been there prior to snowfall. You can tell that whatever made this footprint, or these footprints, must have been extremely heavy. The footprints had easily been 16 inches or more, and were only faded a little bit, so they were pretty well preserved, but I think that was due to the cold, frigid temps. It was interesting to note that there were 5 clearly defined toes in the footprint, as well as no real arch. It was clearly a bipedal footprint I was looking at. The footprints loosely were around the riverbank and went into the direction of the woods. What's even crazier is the stride. The stride between the footprints was roughly 5 to 6 feet. What on earth would have that kind of stride out here? I didn't really feel like even trying to figure out what it could be. I thought about following the footprints, but I immediately considered that being a bad idea, just because 1, I don't know what animal made them, and 2, it was in a totally different direction than the way I wanted to go. I'm an explorer, but I'm not stupid enough to potentially put myself in a dangerous situation, especially when I am not familiar with what I'm dealing with. I don't have any casting material or any of that stuff with me, nor do I ever carry it because I don't make molds of tracks. This just happened to be tracks that I happened to run into. I ended up going back to my car sometime later, and driving back home I couldn't stop thinking about it. I have a few friends of mine who are close with me that are Bigfoot enthusiasts, so I brought it up with them, and they were ecstatic that I told them about this. Not only did they tell me I ran into Bigfoot footprints, but they also shared with me some of their own hair-raising encounters that they had out in those same woods. You know, at this point, I don't know if Bigfoots really do exist, but I definitely can say that those footprints are pretty unexplainable, and I have no idea what animal made them. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to subscribe to What Lurks Beneath and leave a comment and a like. All of it helps my channel grow. Keep your eyes peeled for whatlurksbeneath.com coming soon, where you can submit your very own scary story directly to me and have it read on this channel and heard by thousands. We'll be having new merchandise coming soon down the line, as well as a weekly podcast series coming out. Many great things are on the horizon. Stay tuned, fans. Didn't happen to me, but I happened to a family that is or was extremely anti-paranormal or supernatural things. They never believed stuff, and to this day, they still try and think of a rational explanation as to what happened. They live in a rural area in a big old house, and one night they heard knocking on the door. When they went to the door, instead of opening it, they looked out the top window and didn't see anyone. A little while later, more knocks on the front door, but also their back door and side door. This was the middle of the night, so they assumed some people were going to break in. Makes sense since someone knocked on their door earlier in the day and no one answered. They grabbed their guns and stayed at the ready in case somebody came in. Instead of somebody breaking down the door, more knocks were heard. This time, also on the walls. The husband mustered up enough courage to finally look outside, and what he saw didn't make sense. Wolves. Wolves, not coyotes, were circling around the old house. This also happened in the Southern Plains area, where no wolves live. Sure, maybe coyotes, cougars, or even a bear or two, but wolves? As I've said, this husband and wife still don't know exactly how wolves managed to knock on their doors and walls, but they are determined it wasn't supernatural. I don't know. If that happened to me, I would be a little on the skeptical side. My mom is from a really small town in Mexico, and they have the craziest stories from elves to witches to all other sorts of creatures. I would always hear about witches playing at night and turning into balls of fire and bouncing around, but I was always kind of skeptical. Well, one night, my husband took me to a place in Hidalgo, Mexico. It's like a remote area where there's a huge crater in the ground, and it's only about 20 minutes away from my mom's town. It was around 10 or 11 p.m., and of course, nobody was around. It was just me and my husband, and I was able to clearly see these balls of fire bounce from different sides of the crater, literally like they were playing. There's a tiny little town at the bottom of the crater, and they don't even have electricity, so it wasn't lights or anything like that. I honestly went not expecting to see anything, and I don't know if the witches saw us or not, but they weren't trying to hide what they were doing. These balls of fire can appear anywhere, not just this specific crater, because I've heard so many stories like this from people in Mexico, including my dad, who's from another town. But it's more common to see them in the hills, mountains or craters where they can bounce around. I also saw a fairy, and that was here in the U.S., but that's another story. Back in either the summer of 91 or 92, because it was when I hung out with a different group of kids. We lived and played out on the street, with 3 of the kids lived, and another one's backyard ran up against it. On this street, all the houses were kind of old, and there was one empty lot next to a spooky old house. Nothing ever happened with that house either. It was just spooky. The woods ran along and down from the west sides of the houses and ran up against the Trinity River. On the other side of the river was what used to be Carswell Air Force Base. We accidentally trespassed there once. Had 3 soldiers in full camo holding guns aimed at my chest. But that's a different story. We played in those woods, swam in the river, and generally got up to no good in those woods. There were always rumors that some satanic cult did stuff down in those woods, and we were told to stay away. But being young teens, we didn't listen. One of the days we'd been running around and exploring the woods, maybe hunting squirrels with a BB gun and pellets, I don't know, until we all got a weird vibe. Something didn't feel right. We decided to call it off early and made our way up out of the woods. We went into an empty lot and looked out over the woods, across the river, and at the base. That's when we heard it. This god-awful scream that sounded like something out of a monster movie. It was half a monstrous roar, and yet it had a human quality to it. But it was loud. Oh my god, how it was loud. It chilled me to the bone. It chills me to the bone now, 28 years later. I don't know what in the hell we heard, but we all heard it. It was the first time in my life that I used profanity. That fork of the Trinity River was fed in part by the spillway off of Lake Worth. Decades ago, there were stories of the Goatman out that way. Silly stuff, but stories were told nonetheless. With it being a military facility, it would not surprise me if some weird experiments were done, and somehow a creature had escaped and was on the loose. I wish I could plug something up to my brain so I could convey that sound. I think it might have been a Bigfoot though, because later on in life, I would look up sounds on YouTube, and the closest I can describe it was what I had heard from a Bigfoot call if you look up Bigfoot sounds on YouTube. This was in Fairview, Tennessee in 2004. I was on my family's property that was a couple of acres and walking around picking up trash, trying to keep the land clean. It's a very overcast day in the fall, probably late September, early October, and out of nowhere, I hear this total cacophony of noise coming from the tree line to the back of our property. I turn my head, expecting to see some of our neighbor's cattle coming through a hole in the fencing or something. Instead, I see a massive bird. To this day, the image of this bird is seared into my mind. The thing looked like a golden eagle and had to be about 10 feet tall from head to toe, with a wingspan of 20-ish feet. I hit puberty pretty early, and I was already 6 feet tall by this point. I just couldn't believe the sight of this bird. I could have easily ridden on it. It had came through the forest and had attempted to perch itself on a bundle of trees that it had gripped in its talons. But the trees were all pretty wimpy, and it dwarfed them easily. After 2 of the trees snapped, the bird quickly flapped its wings and took off to the sky. It shot straight upward in a way that I've never seen a bird do before, and soared almost instantly above the clouds. I sat there for another hour hoping it would come back, but nobody in my family believed me. The thing I think most about those days were, in the weeks leading up to my sighting, we had been finding a ton of dead deer and cows in the area that were nearly picked clean. Most of them had had their ribs broken inwards and large gashes in their backs and sides. All I've been able to think about is how it had to have been a massive bird hunting experience. My family still doesn't believe me, nor did anyone in the area except for a trucker that claims he saw the same thing flying in the night sky near Brentwood, Tennessee, a few months earlier during the summer. But I like to think of that bird as the Lord of the Sky, the absolute apex aerial lifeform. Around sundown, my dog loves to sit at the window and watch, noticing any movement out the window. Whenever she does see something, she'll growl, and I'll always look to myself to see if she's growling at plants moving or something legitimate. This particular night, I noticed something emerge from a bush diagonally across the street. It stopped in the middle of the street, and I got my mom to also see it before it continued out of our view. It looked to be around 1.5 feet tall. It wasn't wide or long, but appeared stout. It may sound silly, but I would describe it as the silhouette of a gnome. It could have been a child, but if it were, then the child would have to be wearing a heavy jacket because of how it appeared to be so stout. But this was in August, 80-degree weather. My brother suggested it was a black fox that we know lives around here, which is a good suggestion, but the way it had a bounce in its step was something only a bipedal could make. Imagine a child of sort ham-footing around, excited to get where they're going. It was like that. My dad has told me lots of stories about things he has seen as a kid when he lived in Mexico. One night, he woke up around 2 to 3 in the morning because he had to use the bathroom. Back then, there wasn't a bathroom in the house he lived in, so he had to go outside. He woke up one of his older brothers to go outside with him because he was scared. So they went outside. My dad went behind a bush, and his brother was out there nearby to keep him company, telling him to hurry up since he wanted to go back to sleep. Then, my dad sees this tiny figure in the distance. He said it looked like a doll or something, but it had red, glowing eyes, and as it got closer, it got bigger in size. My dad was terrified and called his brother to come over to where he was by the bush. My dad whispered to his brother and tells him what he sees. So they both look at the doll creature when all of a sudden it runs off to the side into some other bushes, but really, really fast. My dad and his brother both look at each other and run back inside. When I was a kid, I often went to my grandparents' house with my mother. The house was in France, right by a forest and a few abandoned fields full of grass, right at the limit of the village. I was like 8 years old at the time, and I used to ride my little bicycle around the house. But I always felt weird when I was behind the house, on the forest side, without being able to explain it. The weird thing is that one day I was riding around the house as usual, passing my mother's parked car, and I saw a little man inside the car watching me. What was weird is that I remember having seen him first, but not really paying attention to him, as if it were normal. I can still remember his face nowadays, nearly 30 years later. He was probably about 50 centimeters high, and had a mustache and a weird grin, so I didn't pay attention to it, and made another lap around the house, and I saw him again, looking at me. Except that this time, I totally panicked and ran inside, calling for my mom and grandma, telling them about what I had seen. After insisting a bit, they came down to check, and of course, there was no one. Oh, and I went back there a few years ago. Grandparents long dead, so the house is abandoned, but that forest feels even more hostile than it did when I was a kid. When I was a kid, maybe 7, I went to a place that was a very big subject for a lot of paranormal activity. My Aunt Shelley. I won't disclose much, but we're from the Northeast, and like way up north. My Aunt Shelley was obsessed with fairies. She had dolls, which I can give the story on some other day. But anyway, that moved around without her touching them. Paintings, murals, rugs, coffee mugs. Everything fairies. And black grapes. Anyway, I was in her fairy garden, and I noticed a very tiny set of garden furniture. Like what I could describe as a cast iron glass top garden table and 4 chairs. I'm really curious about it, so I lean in closer and move away a vine of the black grapes, so she grew so much of them, and behind it, there are 5 fairies, tiny, sickly thin, stark white with stringy hair, like that stuff that grows under corn husks, and no faces. I watched them all sit and eat the 5th fairy in a grotesque way. I'm not sure what happened after that. I think my mom came and picked me up and brought me inside for dinner. I can't remember. I was so focused on the tiny bones cracking, the ribs sticking out of the chest, and the sticky black blood. It's been like 14 to 15 years. I was camping in an area with a lot of Bigfoot sightings. I was almost asleep when my mom calls my name. She says, "I hear Bigfoot." Now, we had lived in the mountains for many years. We had a small ranch with horses, chickens, pigs, etc. I've been hunting my whole life and have basically grown up in the mountains. I have never heard anything like this. It was loud. Louder than an elk bugle. All the dogs in the area were going crazy. For over an hour, we listened to it. Sometimes it sounded like it was getting really close, but then it would go away. It was moving all over the place. Really freaky. So, I live in Oregon, and the woods are basically unavoidable here. One time while camping with a friend, we went out hiking. While hiking, we heard a loud, deeply inhuman scream down near the creek. This basically scared us both shitless, and we made like a 1-mile run within 5 minutes. By the way, it didn't sound like an elk, goat, or any kind of animal. It sounded almost like a really weird noise. I don't know how else to describe it. Also, the campground was Trout Creek, and it's kind of close to Sweet Home, Oregon. Beautiful place, by the way, to go check out. I'm going back this year, and I'll be sure to record anything strange, and I'll hike the same trail I did last year. Also, any possible explanation for what I could have heard. When I was younger, I would make a game of and practice of calming my mind and making no noise as I walked through the forest. I was out for a hike, and a good 6 miles from the nearest road, walking along an old game trail in the Rockies. I heard a stream up ahead of me, reached it, and began walking along the stream, hoping to find a nice hole with some fish. A few minutes later, I was coming around a big old tree at a bend and saw a small, child-sized figure in weird greenish clothing sitting on a rock with its back towards me. This surprised me, and the instant I saw it, it turned and saw me. I raised my hand and I said, "Hi." While I was doing that, I received a spiritual communication from it. Mainly shock and surprise that I had approached so closely without it noticing. Also, I got the impression that it lived someplace near and frequented the stream. Heard a rustling in the bushes to my right. Glanced over and back, and it was gone. The other one. My parents had bought a home in the same general area of the above encounter, although 20 years later. I was visiting and decided to sleep downstairs, which at that point I don't think anyone had ever spent any time in. The house was just a few years old. As is my habit, I set up the wards around the room before going to sleep. Around 1 a.m., I snapped awake to see a green ball of light come through the south wall about 3 feet up from the floor and stop. Got the same sort of instantaneous form of spiritual communication. It used that particular route to get to where it was going. Lived underground and had been using the same route so long it was not thinking it would encounter anything, much less than a human, and was completely surprised to encounter me in that location, stopping in disbelief. I've seen some weird, paranormal, supernatural things since I was a very small child, so I never shut it out, because I just assume that there's a lot of stuff out there that we know nothing about. When I was in my 20s, I was dating a guy who loved to camp, and so did I. He decided to take me to visit some friends that lived on 150 acres in the Daniel Boone Forest in Kentucky. After the long drive, we arrived and met our hosts, a really lovely couple. They lived in a log cabin that the guy had built with no electricity, and water tapped in from a creek on the property that was so pure you could drink straight out of it. We were walking around the property, checking out the amazing gardens that our house hostess had been growing for the past 20-some years. The property was incredible. There was a cave up at the top of the crest in the forest filled with hieroglyphs. The flowers and fruit trees and vegetables were gigantic. Everything was lush and gorgeous. Their house was set in a cleared area, surrounded by woods and bordered by the creek. As our hostess showed us the gardens, we were standing at the tree line, and I kept seeing a gigantic insect out of the corner of my eye. I'm not afraid of bees, but this thing was huge, so I finally turned to look, and I didn't believe what I was seeing. A tiny man hovered at my shoulder level. He had wings that beat very fast and sounded exactly like a hummingbird's wings. He had black hair, pointed ears, and his clothing was green and almost looked like leaves. I stared for what seemed like minutes but was only seconds, watching him and not really understanding what I was seeing. He put his hands up beside his ears and blew a raspberry at me, smiled mischievously, and flew off lightning fast. I turned back to our hostess, and she saw my face, which must have been a total shock. She smiled so sweetly and said, "Did you see one of the fairies?" She then went on to tell us that the land was filled with them, and that at night we sat on the front porch and watched tiny lights in the grass floating up and coming back down. My boyfriend and I slept in our tent outside, and I woke up early the next morning and walked around the dew-soaked yard. There were at least 3 perfect fairy rings in the grass. I have been to a lot of special places, but that one is the most magical and beautiful I have ever seen. I don't know the proper name for it, but it was a big black dog wolf-looking thing. It was not a coyote or a dog. It was not a normal animal with mange or anything of the sort. It was about half the size of a car. I saw this creature when I was a child living at my parents' home. Behind us was just woods for about a quarter of a mile. There used to be a small frosted window in the bathroom, which was partially underground. So the window was just at the level of ground, if that makes sense. It was very late at night. I have insomnia, so I wake up 4 to 5 times per night. Anyway, through the window, I saw some type of glowing yellow something, and then movement. I thought it may be a raccoon or something, but it creeped me out. I went back into my room, and the cat was in the windowsill, growling and hissing. At that point, I thought it was another cat outside. I was terrified, but I went to the corner of the window and carefully peeled back the curtain just a sliver. What I saw chilled me to the core. It was some type of massive dog-wolf creature. It had a huge hump on its back and long, greasy-looking fur. As it moved around the yard, it kept tripping the motion sensor light, but it was too far away to see clearly. It looked like it was eating apples that had fallen off of our tree. But the most terrifying part was that it walked on its 2 back legs. I felt my blood turn to ice, and I was totally frozen in fear. I couldn't look away. I stared at it until it made its way back into the woods. I was only about 10 or maybe 11 when this happened. Not me, but my sister. This happened when we were kids. She's probably 4 to 5 years old at the time, and me about 6. We're over at our grandparents' house in the city, and their backyard's full of trees and is sloping down to a river. One late afternoon, we were playing house at the back with just the 2 of us. I walked away for a little bit since, if I remember correctly, I was trying to get something for our play. And when I went back to my sister, she told me she just talked to 2 small people with wings, but that they already flew away. I asked her what they looked like and where these small people were before they flew. And she just told me that 3 to 5 of them landed on the space near the stove and that she wasn't scared. She told me they were nice. Flash forward to this year, I remember asking her about it again just so I can confirm that it did happen and she wasn't bullshitting me then. She said she saw them with her own eyes and that she wouldn't lie about it. Low-key regret is that I wasn't able to meet them myself. I live in a very rural area. My house is literally in the woods. The woods are well known for being haunted. Anyway, one night I was outside letting my dogs out. The woods directly behind my house. There's a few homes down the street, but nobody enters each other's property, and there's no children here. My dogs were barking at the woods, and it sounded like someone was running toward us. I called for my husband to get a flashlight, as hikers tend to end up lost and coming through our property because they see our lights. There wasn't anybody there. An hour or so later, I'm sitting in the living room. It's about 11 p.m. at night. I had my porch light on and the door ajar because it was so hot that night. My dog starts barking and I go outside and this little kid came out of nowhere on a bicycle. I was really concerned, to be honest. This kid looked to be no older than 10. I screamed for him to stop. I wanted to make sure that he wasn't lost. There's campsites in the woods because it is a national park, but it's literally miles away from my home. I was scared that he got lost by himself. He didn't stop. He ended up riding around the block and down the hill and stared at me. He had a gray hoodie on, and his eyes were dark. I panicked and came back inside, locked the doors. I felt sick. I believe after talking with another neighbor who has an even scarier experience than I do, said that it was a black-eyed child. I don't leave my door open no more at night. Nobody believes me besides my neighbors and my husband. First of all, I'm a pagan, which is pretty much an earth-based religion. In a nutshell, I worship the earth. When I was first getting into paganism, or rather Wicca at the time, I had met a group of people who held a gathering on Saturday evenings. It was actually a lot of fun. We would talk about our different paths, joke around. Eventually, the talk turned into how some of them had heard and or seen dragons. At this point, they lost me. I played along with them, but I'm thinking these people are just making stuff up. One guy claimed he lived in the country and would hear roars of the dragons coming from within the woods. I'm thinking it was more likely a bobcat or an angry redneck who lost his beer. For some reason, I looked up in the sky and not a cloud in sight. The sun still up, and the vast blue canvas. I saw what looked like a large snake moving strangely in the sky. Being a huge believer in UFOs, I pointed this out to everyone. It was writhing and wiggling, just like a serpent high in the sky. I couldn't take my eyes off it. Granted, this was before everyone had a phone with a camera, and all I have is a memory. Once I pointed it out, everyone looks up and all agree. Oh, that's a dragon. They know we're talking about them. Now, I'm not saying it was a dragon, but it was definitely a UFO in the sense of the definition. I haven't seen anything like it since, and in all my years in paganism, I still have yet to see any actual dragons. So this happened about 12 years ago. My family owns a farm in the heart of an Indian reservation. One winter, I was home for Christmas, taking care of the farm while my parents were away Christmas shopping. As I was home by myself, way late in the night, and I hear all of our cows freaking out. I knew it had to be the wild dogs that are rampant in the area, so I throw on some boots, grab a shotgun, load it up, and head out to the field. This was a perfect scenario for a horror movie. It was cloudy, but there was a full moon, and it was breaking through the clouds just right to light up all the snow. I ran out into the middle of the field, and just in time I see two dogs. They were standing up facing each other and fighting. I think perfect 2 for 1. So I pump a shell into the chamber of my Mr. 12 gauge, and then it happened. The two dogs heard the rack, and they both stopped, looked over at me, and ran away. On their back legs. I immediately froze, and every ghost story about skinwalkers and all the other native legends I grew up with flew through my mind. Keep in mind, I'm just a white guy, and up until then, these were all just boogeyman stories the native kids like to tell us to scare us. That night, they became real. My uncle and cousin saw a large deer on the side of the road. When they got closer, it hopped over the fence like a bipedal man. One time, driving back from Gallup, my dad saw an old Navajo woman walking on the side of the road, and when he slowed to offer her a ride, she took off into the plains, quickly with inhuman speed. Once when I was a kid, my family was at my aunt's house, which is a rural, secluded area, when we were toyed with by a few different entities. They would make animal noises, and when we looked to the direction from which the noises were coming from, they would turn a flashlight on and off. The noises would come from all directions, and increasingly shorter succession. Usually when I'm there on the reservation visiting, alone, late at night, I will feel the presence of evil and dread, Panic and paranoia will wash over me, and as sudden as it comes, it leaves. My grandmother on my mother's side has always been very superstitious, for lack of a better word. She's not religious, but she does believe in a lot of paranormal stuff. Her mother was full-blooded Navajo, and her father was Irish. Either way, she had never been anywhere east of Montana, and she grew up in Nevada. One year, when I was in grade school, we went to visit her, and most of the visit was pretty uneventful. Typical boring old people stuff, except she always kept her curtains drawn shut and would always peek out the window when someone asked what she was doing. She would reply simply with, "Inaldlushi is watching me." This went on for nearly the entire visit until a few days before we were due to leave. My grandmother and then baby brother, who's 19 now, were in the front yard that evening, planting flowers, when all of a sudden, she's yelling at my little brother to get away from the creature, that it's not safe. Of course, being in Nevada, we all assumed that my brother had found a scorpion or a rattlesnake, so we all ran outside to see my grandmother clutching my little brother and shaking in terror against the side of the house. Standing out in the yard was a large black Great Dane-sized dog. It was staring at my grandmother with an intensity I had never seen before. It looked up at us, gave a little huff, and bounded off. I don't remember if it moved unusually fast or not, but I do remember it had really deep yellow eyes. When my mother asked my grandmother what had happened, she kept repeating, "Inaldlushi has found me." She moved a couple weeks just after that. So, I had a nap this afternoon. Nothing new, but in the dream I was in a super weird rural place and I was walking around the corner of my garden, like between the wall of the house and the fence towards the front of my house. As I'm walking, a huge animal approaches me. It's so big and weird looking, I got absolutely terrified and froze up, hoping it would pass. It had a face that was similar to an anteater, a wide skull tapering into a thin, short snout, large, dark, slanted eyes very far apart from each other. You could see the curve of the skull and the detail of the bone of the nose, like the bridge, I guess. It had sort of flat fur of dark brown. Its body was very thin and similar to a deer or antelope, except the curve of the ribcage was exaggerated, like a greyhound's. The legs were extremely long and ended in parted hoof-toe type feet. It did not have a tail. I felt terrified as I had no idea what the hell it was, and I remember in the dream I was mentally trying to come up with a description or an answer as to what it was. As it passed me in the narrow of a gap, it said hello, and I stared at it, feeling terrified. All of a sudden, it leaned up and stood up on its hind legs. I blinked and it was not a weird antelope-eating dog thing anymore, but instead a woman. An extremely tall woman. She had a slim average figure, brown hair, and was white. She must have been 10 feet tall. She told me she was really happy that I didn't run away from her, as most people are terrified and run away, especially if she speaks. I stood there dumbfounded and told her that I was actually terrified of her because I had never seen anything like her before, but now she had changed and I felt calm. She told me that she's so tall, she normally scares people anyway. She had some sort of injury and I can't remember what it was or how I fixed it, but I do remember fixing it. I don't know how we ended up meeting some other girl outdoors who wasn't some weird creature, just like a regular girl who was very tall, like 6 foot, and I could tell the other girl liked her, so I decided to leave them alone. I got followed by tall creature girl, and only realized upon looking up at the wall and seeing a hole in it and her looking back at me. She was really mad and seemed upset, and I wanted to know why I left her like that. Anyway, long story short, I ended up having a really weird, scary sex dream about me having sex in the woods with that creature girl, in her human state, and some other girls. There was lots of witchcraft in the sex too, and weird symbols in the air, like conscientiously wishing for stuff whilst having sex. It seemed the more I had sex with these girls, the more control I had over the world in my dreams, and I was making people do stuff just by thinking about it during the sex. There was also the appearance of a man who has previously really hurt me. He stood at the top of the path in the dark, watching me having sex. The dream was really scary, as most of the time I had no idea what the hell was going on or why I was having sex with all these girls. I was also afraid of the creature girl. Even during sex, I was scared of her. I only woke up from this stupidly long nap because my dog got on the bed with me and sat next to my face whining and pawing. Safe to say it shook me up, and now it's 4 a.m. and I don't want to sleep as I feel uneasy about what I might dream about. I've always had really weird scary dreams, especially when my PTSD is severe, but I've never had a dream like that before, and the whole weird creepy creature transforming into a girl who then seduces me theme got me really worried. It's like my subconscious went off and took acid last night whilst I was nodding off. Also, as an FYI, I'm a 24-year-old queer girl dating a bi dude, and I live in the UK. I'm basic Irish ethnicity. Nothing super interesting. I'm a pagan. My family are Catholic though, and I was raised Catholic. So it's not like having sex with girls is weird, it's just this specific incident felt so real. I had actually physical pleasure from the dream. Also, why did my brain decide to create a really scary animal hybrid? I'm not quite sure. Is it possible that a skinwalker or a wendigo seduced me and used my dreams to get into my life, or possibly attach itself to me? What do you think? I lived in Gallup, New Mexico over a decade ago as a teacher. Most of my students were Navajo, and some talked to me about skinwalkers. My personal experiences aren't that exciting. My roommate and I heard a weird scream gurgle outside of our house. We sent our male neighbors to investigate, and they didn't find anything. We went to a haunted canyon. It had been closed the weekend before because of skinwalker activity in the area. Terrifying. My students mentioned having different ceremonies interrupted by skinwalkers howling and scratching at their doors. They also said I could go down to a certain lake at night and watch the skinwalkers come to drink. I am happy I never encountered one of these things during my time in New Mexico, but they really, really interest me, even though I want to stay as far away from them as I can. One of my daughters is going to turn 21 in December, and she would like to take a family trip to Colorado as her present. Some of you have read my experiences and know that I have not been off the East Coast since returning here to escape the skinwalker that was tormenting me. I never planned to go back to Arizona ever in my life. You couldn't pay me $7 million to do it. But since Colorado is near Arizona, and I never engaged in any kind of ceremony or ritual to break whatever bond it had to me, I can't help but wonder, could it still be waiting for me? It's been decades since my encounters, so realistically, I know it probably isn't out there, and I know that Colorado is a big place, but I'm still kind of nervous. My daughter does not want me to go if I feel afraid, but she seems really wanting to go to Colorado, and I wouldn't want to disappoint her, especially on her 21st birthday. Is there some kind of native ritual that they use to keep skinwalkers away? I hope this isn't offensive, and I don't want to make fun of anyone's culture. I have great respect for natives and just want to ease my mind for the trip. I 100% believe in skinwalkers, and if there is anything the natives use to keep them away, I will do it as respectfully as I can. I am not the kind of person to think every shadow, weird noise, or bump in the night is a monster, and I would never claim it to be a skinwalker unless I truly believe it to be one. I recently started researching skinwalkers as I'm a big horror fan, and body horror is what scares me the most. As I'm reading stories, I'm noticing scary parallels to what I saw as a child. I was in the woods outside my house with my dog, and each time I went in, I'd go in further, and this time was the furthest I'd ever gotten. I found a sort of broken down brick building. It was only big enough to be some kind of shed and only had 3 walls, which were really only about 4 feet tall. On the outside of the structure were a pile of deer skins, and on the inside were deer bones. It was a long time ago, so I could be wrong, but I specifically remember there being no meat. I booked it home and decided to not go back into the woods. At least not with it just being me and my dog. Later on in life, some of the local kids come up and ask me to go in the woods with them, because one had apparently saw something weird. So I tag along and we eventually make it pretty deep when we all see this creature crawling up a hill. I should clarify that the woods here are in a form of a V shape, with a creek running down the center. We were on one side of the V, and it was on the opposite. It looked like it could have been either a dog with very short white hair, like a greyhound, or a dog with no fur at all. It was super pale and quite lanky, and the joints where a normal dog should be were wrong. The hind legs looked normal, but its front legs bent more like a person dragging itself. It was having trouble climbing the hill as it was, and it looked like it kept sliding down from the dead leaves covering the ground. It was broad daylight, but we were all unanimously scared shitless and decided to book it back home. This was back when I was in middle school, and nothing has happened since. Then again, I also had never returned to the woods since. Now, mind you, the woods are by no means in the middle of nowhere. We were easily a 3-minute sprint away from a neighborhood no matter what direction we went. So it could have easily been a runaway dog, and fear made me think it was worse than it really was, but that's why I'd like to hear your opinion on what happened. So, a long while ago, me and a very close friend of mine got bored and decided to discover the nearby woods. We lived in a secluded area where we had a thick forest around us for miles, and frankly, the rural area was boring. We had no one from our age and no internet, so while we were sitting aimlessly, we decided to pack some stuff and wander into the woods. Now, my friend is a huge guy, mainly because he's obsessed with bodybuilding, so it was a bit hard for someone to scare him. But as we walked in, we both had an eerie feeling that we were being watched. The mood was tense, and strangely, the woods were dead silent. No birds chirping, no wind, and no sound of an animal or an insect. Not even a cricket. Approximately after 20 minutes of nothing but scaring ourselves, we heard a bark. And where I live, we have stray dogs, both in the streets and in wooded areas. And the ones that are in the wooded areas are not as friendly as the ones in the streets, because they are mainly really hungry. We stopped in our tracks and paid close attention to where the sound was coming from. It was coming from our left and sounded close. However, as the bark kept on, we both realized that there was something off about it. I don't know how to put it, but it was almost like somebody was trying to impersonate a dog and doing a very good job at it, but not quite the same. Then, we realized another odd thing about our supposed canine friend. The bark was repetitive, like it was playing on a speaker on repeat. My friend said that something is off, and he is genuinely creeped out. And I'm not gonna lie, I was shaking. You might say that it's quite natural to get creeped out in the woods, in the middle of the night, out in the middle of nowhere. But this was different. Every single fiber on our bodies wanted to say, "Get out," but we were scared to move. Finally, I told my friend to run, and quite reluctantly, he obliged. We ran like our lives were depending on it, and still felt like that thing was chasing us. We were out of breath when we found our way back, and my buddy said he heard branches breaking as we were hauling ass out of there, and he was on the very verge of crying hysterically out of pure fear. Strangest thing, however, is the fact that we both live in a country which has nothing to do with America, let alone Native American culture. What do you think was chasing and stalking us back there? Do you have any similar experiences yourself? I live in Utah, more northern, not Navajo Nation, but I'm only about 3 hours from the Adamantium Skinwalker Ranch for a reference to how close I am to Skinwalker territory. I live in a neighborhood, so not secluded at all, but it is on the very top of a mountain. Surrounding my neighborhood is just the mountains and nothing else. So basically, just a neighborhood carved into the mountain literally. Only clearings where houses and yards are, very wooded. Anyway, I'm not scared of the forest or even the mountains, and I don't mind being alone. The only thing that worries me is other humans, and cougars sometimes as well. I'm a young girl. I've slept in the mountains a lot with only my dad's dog, or friend even. Sometimes the dark spooks me, but not dark forests or anything like that in particular. I'm pagan and real big into spirituality and connection with nature and the earth. So for the most part, I find comfort exclusively when I'm outdoors. So, when I do feel uneasy or afraid when I'm in nature, I always feel like it's for a good reason. I never ignore it. I usually get home from work pretty late, at around 10:30 at night. This whole drive home, once I come up on the mountain, I was feeling really uneasy, and I was dreading getting out of my car and walking into my house. I have a fear of skinwalkers and entities alike, and I know that attracts them. So I always try and shake those thoughts as soon as they enter my head. But they always do. That night was no different. But I felt like my fear was for a reason. I didn't want to be outside for a second longer, so I just got out of my car and ran back to my door. I was so nervous. It was that horrible feeling where you feel like you look behind you and something horrible will happen. Nothing did, luckily. I locked my doors and went to sleep. The night was normal. In the morning, however, I went outside and there was a bone fragment outside my house near my porch. I'm not saying it was human, probably just animal. It looked like it came from a large bone, but again, it was just a piece. Probably deer? I know I live near coyotes and predators, and there's probably a logical explanation for this. But the bone was dry, not previously removed from something. It was old, no meat, no blood. It was just weird that this showed up overnight, and it wasn't there the day before. I don't have a dog at this house. Just the weird feeling the night before, and then the bone? Creepy. My boyfriend and I were on our way to meet his parents at a campsite last night, up on a small mountain in central Arkansas. It was dark by the time we got up there, and we were traveling down some pretty windy roads through the forest. We start going past a little field area by the side of the road, filled with tall grass, and I saw some eyes reflecting light. Super bright though, almost like they were lights themselves. I've never seen a normal animal's eyes reflect light like this did. It was weird. The grass was pretty tall, so I only really saw the head, but it just looked like some creature literally bouncing through the field. It didn't seem like it had any fur, and I didn't see any ears. It looked like it may have been on 2 feet, because it definitely didn't look like any four-legged animal from its posture. We thought it might have been a deer, but we saw some actual deer a few minutes later, and it looked like nothing like those. They were way smaller, and their eyes weren't reflecting the light like this thing was. I didn't get a super good look because I only saw it for a few seconds, but it was just strange. It wasn't like my brain spent any time trying to figure out what it was, it just immediately went to fear. Like that thing isn't normal, get away. There's also been disappearances in the area that fit the criteria for being Skinwalker related. Not really related to this story, but my boyfriend's uncle has seen multiple Sasquatch on this mountain. So there are other cryptids here. Do you think we saw a Skinwalker? I was living in a smallish town last year with an interesting design. The front of the houses faced each other, but instead of streets, the front doors led to paths that formed something akin to a park walkway. Back of the houses opened on a horseshoe type of street. One area was in the middle of a couple apartment buildings, so it had a playground, a basketball court, and all of that jazz. I went for a walk around 1 in the morning to smoke a joint, so I go to the area with the court, sit on a bench, and light one up. After maybe 3 minutes of smoking, I look a bit to my left, and about 20 yards away, directly under a streetlight, are 2 very tall shapes. They're standing perfectly still, with no discernible features, and they were black. Not like a shadow person or a morph suit, but Vanta black. They're sucking the light and the warmth in. I know they're staring at me. I could feel it. I could feel the hate, the absolute certainty that if they were to come any closer, my life would more likely never be right again. Now, it takes quite a fair bit to make me afraid, but what went through me was pure, primal fear. I've seen ghosts by the dozen, and I've never been afraid. This was like staring the devil in the face and feeling the pure, unadulterated hatred radiating off of him. It took me 10 minutes of just being frozen in fear before I could stand up and book it out of there. And all in the time I had my eyes on them, there were no movement of any kind, no sound, no indication they were alive. I've not seen that since, but it got me looking up shadow people and the like. And I guess, according to the people with more experience and knowledge, there weren't shadow people. Apparently, due to their height, the darkness they were made of, and the feelings I got from them, they were demonic in origin. So that's my little story from hell. I see shadow people in my peripheral vision all the time, and have done so for the majority of my life. It intensified when I started living with my boyfriend. I never mentioned anything about them, but my boyfriend randomly mentioned seeing weird things around the house. He would tell me he'd see someone standing there out of the corner of his eye, but when he looked, it was gone. One of the very consistent shadow people I see is one that glides past our window at nighttime. I saw it all the time and never mentioned it to my boyfriend. After I'd been living with him for a while, I'd noticed him quickly turning his head to look at the window at night while we were watching TV. Eventually, he told me he keeps on seeing something pass by the window, but it didn't make any noise, since our window was open at the time, and we had lots of dry leaves and twigs in that part of the yard. It's not headlights creating shadows. Outside of the window will be completely dark. Something even darker just passes through. I've only seen 2, and neither was on a flat surface. While driving around, looking at abandoned houses, some friends and I drove past an occupied house from which both of them got a sinister vibe. I went back several times to show other friends, and the first 2 involved in these. The house is about 40 feet back from the street, and the yard has a lot of low, scrubby bushes. The first time, we pulled a T-turn in front, and a person-shaped shadow, flat back and unreflective, walked through our headlight beams about 10 feet in front of us, in front of some bushes and behind others. Our headlights reflecting off the house showed us the figure. We knew how far away it was by its size in relation to the house, and it being in the middle of the shrubs, which came up to just below its knees. Second time going by, there was a boat and a truck parked side by side next to the house, with the floodlight on the house shining right at them. This time, the figure walked in front of the truck and boat, towards the house, but upon reaching it, either disappeared or walked through the side of the house. On later visits there, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Basically, for years, one shadow person, which seemed male in retrospect, used to stand by my mom's bed and essentially would force me to go sleep. He would interrupt me reading books by basically being so distracting and then eventually intimidating. I had to leave the light on or even pull the covers over my head just to fall asleep. His shape was kind of an adult-sized oval with diffused edges, and he wouldn't really move. He only really ever occupied 2 spots next to the bed. Once, when I was maybe 4, I saw several very clear human shadows on the wall. They looked like people waiting for a subway train or maybe guests at a museum milling about in front of a painting. I think this is not a unique phenomenon. I feel like I've read similar experiences, if anybody knows. They seemed to be watching my family and I. We were all sleeping at my grandparents', and they had a small house, so we had set up a bed of blankets and pillows on the living room floor. My dad and brother were already asleep. I sat upright just staring at them, watching us. They seemed very casual and relaxed, walked around and talked to each other. They seemed very much like silhouettes of living humans. I also got the sense that they didn't know I could see them. Anyway, I eventually got up and found my mom in the kitchen. She asked why I was still awake, and I told her I was watching the people. What people? The people on the wall? What? There's people on the wall watching us. What? No, you didn't see that. Go lie down. My mom had gotten freaked out. Not a person, but most recently, I got to see a ghost cat. I was walking toward my bedroom in the dimly lit darkness, and I see this small, football-like shadow near the ground kind of bounce past my feet and ahead of me, kind of like a playful cat. Bounce, bounce, bounce. Left, right, and left. After the initial surprise and confusion, it left me absolutely delighted. Cutest ghost ever. I recall a dream I had where I was outside during the night on my old childhood street. The road was lit up from the streetlights in the usual orange color, and in my dream, I saw tons of shadow people walking on the other side of the street from where I was on the sidewalk, and all I could do to tell myself was to act normal, as if there was nothing out of the ordinary. I remember seeing them literally everywhere, but they didn't notice me or do anything, and all I could see was shadows that resembled human figures. I saw a shadow person in my great aunt's house when I was about 8 years old. All of us were outside saying goodbye to each other when I looked up into a second-story window, which was a bedroom, and saw a shadow figure that was turned to the side. The shadow quickly moved to the left, as if it was sucked in that direction. It was like the movement was being led by the shadow's chest, if that makes any sense. It was really freaky, and when I thought of the layout of the house, the shadow would have been moving into a closet. I've seen them for as long as I could remember. I had one that was constant when I was a kid, to the point I would try to feed them. My mom has stories of watching me drop raisins in midair trying to feed someone, and getting really frustrated and yelling that if they weren't going to even try, I wasn't going to waste my raisins. In high school, we moved and the house there seemed to be riddled with them. My friends saw one in the middle of the night, sitting on the foot of my bed, just staring at her. Someone else saw one go down our hallway towards my room. My sister and I called him Sergeant Pepper because it looked like he had a wide-brimmed hat, and there was always the smell of fresh ground black pepper when we would see him. I have a photo somewhere of my dog staring at a bright orange orb. My dad saw a woman in white on Christmas in that house. Another friend saw a little boy in our living room playing with blocks, who of course was gone when she came to get me. There was a peeping ghost at that house. Always was seen looking in my sister's window. She would stand there and watch it while I ran outside, and she just said it would turn its head when it heard me coming, then just vanish. We had a fenced-in yard and dog. It wasn't human. There was a lot of other things that happened with no evidence of shadow people involved in that house. Now that I've moved, I see them mostly at a distance, most often in our parking lot, and half the time I just assume it's a trick of the light, until my boyfriend says he just saw someone duck down behind a car. I was walking out my parents' back door, and I turned my head slightly and saw the door open with a shadow move through and run down the stairs to my right. I 100% thought my brother ran down for a beer in the basement. I had to go down and check after he didn't answer, and no one was there. I know it sounds lame, but I saw it in the right 50% of my vision, not my peripheral. It was around 4 feet tall, amorphous, but in a spiky way. Best description is the ICP logo with no axe, or like a person drawn like a Jolteon, with long slender endings for legs and arms. For those that aren't familiar with what a Jolteon is a Pokemon, which you can Google, Jolteon, Jolteon. Later that night, the soap and lotion containers next to the sink swept themselves off the counter on their own. I recreated the move I made a dozen times to confirm I didn't push them. Nothing before or after this night. I don't know what to think of it other than I saw it and I don't know what to do with the information now. I was about 8 years old at the time, sleeping in bunk beds. I'm on top, my sister below. I woke up and looked toward my door and saw what looked like a witch shape, pointy hat, pointy nose, clawed fingers. Almost exactly like the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz, Shirley Temple Black version. It creeped toward my bed in a smooth, sliding fashion, until it got to the little ladder. I was a bit scared and unsure what to do. I had been clenching my Wicked E. Warwick stuffed bear and felt bolstered to act. I held Wicket by his legs and swung at the shadow's head, forcefully saying, "Go away." And it did. Just sort of, puff, gone. No swirly mist or anything. It just stopped being there. Never saw it again. I attribute seeing this shadow to the mental and violent physical abuse my mother had started inflicting on me and my sister at the time. I also think I developed a fear of absolute darkness at this age. I always feel like I'm being watched if I know I'm alone and can't see anything due to no light. 4 years ago, I was experimenting with astral projection, and I almost succeeded from the first try, and other paranormal stuff like contacting spirits, Ouija boards, etc. Until one night, I woke up. I would presume it was around 2 to 4 a.m. to see what I can barely describe as a burning shadow, like a black fire. A while ago, I was rewatching the 2013 remake of The Evil Dead, and this drawing from the movie reminded me of it. But anyway, the second I saw it, I lost the ability to breathe. I remember that I started kicking while gasping heavily for air as it was choking me. Then, I passed out. But weirdly enough, when I woke up the next day, I was confused. I was thinking, what the hell happened last night? I couldn't remember it at first, but then I remembered it immediately. It was weird. Maybe something more happened that night, but needless to say, I never experimented with that again since. First time I was 10 years old. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at my door, and there was a shadow person standing there in the hallway. I used to sleep with the door open, and I could clearly see the outline of it. It was static though. The outline was clear but shifted, like there was an interference in what I was seeing. I could tell I was being watched and looked at,
but there was no facial features, just a black mass in the shape of a person. The figure darted to the left of the doorframe and entered the living room. I could hear its footsteps, oddly enough. It came back, then stopped in my doorway again before going down the hall towards my parents' room. I got up to look, and of course nothing. I sleep with my door closed now. I never saw it again in that house. I heard it, though, walking through the house many times. It wasn't until I moved into my current place that I saw them again. This time, much more frequently. I see them every few weeks or so now. They don't bother me. I don't bother them. We simply coexist. Once on vacation with my family, I woke up in the middle of the night for some reason, and I hear someone at the door. The resort rooms were in a motel style where you were outside before you went in. The bed I was in was closest to the door, and I was on the edge of the bed near it. I watched as the door handle started to jiggle a little, and I didn't know what to think. I looked behind me and saw each one of my family members in bed asleep. I knew I was awake, and I knew it was not one of them. The door started to open, and I just stared. A black figure started gliding toward me slowly. It became right to the edge of the bed in front of me and reached its arms out to me. I just stared up at it terrified and told me, "Come with me." I didn't move or say anything. I just kept staring. It then started to move backwards, and then I started shaking my sister next to me aggressively, saying, "Do you see it? Do you see that?" And I kept looking back at it while trying to wake her up. Right as she woke up, it disappeared into a dark corner. It still scares me to think about it. I was on a hometown vacation with my mom and granny. What the hell on earth was woken me up in the middle of the night? The light was killed, and then I sensed something weird. I checked that my mom and granny were still sleeping in nets, while someone or something stood in front of the edge of my bed. It was a pitch black entity. It put me on a negative state of frightening. I couldn't do a single movement until it came towards me, and then I screamed out, waking everybody up. They put on the light and see nothing. Now my mom was pissed off and blamed that one of my imaginary friends, since I used to be an imaginative kid. But I swear it's real, not a nightmare. I don't know if it matters, but I live in the corner of all my neighboring townhouses. It's a 2-story house, and I have a yard and a parking parallel to my yard. One half of the house is not attached to anything. The other side is a neighboring 1-story house. I can clearly see the parking lot 15 yards away from my bedroom window, so I'm super close to my vehicle. July 2017, on a Monday, I was taking a shower in Miami, Florida, in my townhouse. I could hear a TV novella, kind of like the Spanish programming, or Family Feud with lots of cheering and talking. I don't ever watch novellas, so I look over my balcony after I dry myself off, and all the lights are off. At first, I thought it was my dad or my brother, because we are roommates in a 3-bedroom, but I was alone. I just went back in my room and played piano. Tuesday, I heard the TV show Cheerings again, but now followed by footsteps going up or down the stairs. I couldn't tell. I get out wet and pray somebody is home. No one is home, though all the lights are off and my TV's off downstairs. So I go in my room and seclude myself and play video games again. Wednesday, I hear the same as yesterday. I run all the way downstairs and grab my sharp $100 kitchen knife, run through each room looking for some intruder. I check everything except the attic in my dad's bedroom, because it's tiny, and frankly, there's no ladder. I go in my room, set my alarm for work, and my blinds are wide open, so I could see my black Cadillac Escalade. I swear on my sister's life, I see a trench-coated fedora-wearing man near my car, but not touching it. And at first, I don't think anything paranormal. I thought it was a neighbor walking by because of how close the houses are, and the street lamp is pretty bright. But then I noticed them not moving, so I began to think they are looking inside of my car, trying to case it and steal something. But I get closer to the window and notice its shoulders aren't facing towards my car. It's facing towards me and standing unnaturally still. I dial my girl with the phone still in hand and keep staring at it to make sure I'm not hallucinating. I look away and look back, but it's still there. I explain to her, "Babe, I think someone is trying to steal from my car, but they're not moving. It feels very eerie." She says to make sure all my doors are locked in case they are trying to break into my place. But why are they wearing a trench coat? It's humid as hell in Florida. You can literally sweat outside at nighttime just being naked. I look at the clock and realize I have been staring at someone standing still for 2 entire minutes. 120 seconds. I go downstairs, check every door again. I have an even bigger window downstairs, facing my parking lot, but I don't see anybody standing by my car. I look at my oven and notice it's around 10, and either my brother or dad will get home soon. So I tell that to my girlfriend, run upstairs and lock my door with my knife in my room. I leave every light in my house on at this point. I don't see the fedora user by my caddy anymore, and I do feel relief, but stress. So I sit down, blast my speakers, and start playing games. I pause my music and continue speaking to my girl, and tell her that, "Babe, people say that you can't be a pussy in front of ghosts. Supposedly, they feed off fear, and if I continue to be scared of them, they will." In the middle of me saying, "They will feed off my fear," I could feel a cold finger or object run up my spine from the crack of my behind up to my neck, very slowly. If I could guesstimate, it would be 15 seconds to travel, and it was as if something super cold like a finger sitting in ice was touching me from the inside of my body. As the 15 seconds pass, while it's running up my spine, I start hearing a loud pitch, getting louder and louder. My speakers are muted, by the way, so it wasn't coming from them. As it finally reaches my neck, I feel a chill come down on my body like I have never before. I'm from Florida, but I've been in the snow before, and that was colder and stiffer than freezing temperatures. Then my book bag on my bed goes flying at the window that looks out towards my Cadillac. I turn my head with both hands on my piano, and my head hugging my shoulder because I'm on the phone with my girl, and see most of the shutter closed by something hitting it. I peek on the side of the bed and see my book bag upside down, and fear comes over my body like a warm blanket. I run out of the room in boxers and a tank top, struggling to grab pants. So I frustratingly just grab the blanket and run outside barefooted on the phone, still sitting in the table between my house and my car, and waited for an hour for my family to get home. The aftermath was my family laughing at me, followed by jokes from them being in my underwear. Aside from the jokes, my dad's side is involved in Santeria, so my dad immediately took my aunt's house to grab sage, espanta muerto from the plant they have in their backyard, and Santeria chalk. We saged down the house. Our family psychic told us to draw crosses on the inside and outside of every type of doorway, no matter if it's a closet leading nowhere, or even my attic. The type of chalk they use in Santeria is made out of chicken eggs. I don't know if that information matters, but I'll just leave it in here. We got 10 vases or so, filled them up with a cup and a half of water each, separated an even amount of false daisy, evenly in all the vases, and added in a vase in each room, including the bathrooms. Espanta muerto means scare the dead, and people use it to basically detect if spirits are in the house without EMF meters. We left them in each room, Went to bed that Wednesday, and on Thursday, all the plants were alive, except my brother's room. It was completely wilted. To me and my dad, it makes sense because a week prior, he fought with my dad and he had been looking for a job for 4 months, and my dad wanted him to help with rent, so he would always put off interviews, and my dad eventually got fed up that week prior and told him he needs to leave or get a job. They both screamed at each other, and he ended up talking about how he's 23 and doesn't know what he wants to do in life, and he's been looking up different graphic designing or logo creation jobs for people so he wouldn't have to work at McDonald's. And his girlfriend, he broke up with him in early 2017, still had him depressed, and he was telling my dad he felt like killing himself, and then fell into my dad's arms, so my dad started crying as well. They both sat down and made a plan on finding a job, which he eventually did. But I say this because there was a lot of negative energy every time he would come home. He was secluded in that room, and it turned out that that room failed the false daisy test. We kept all the flowers, only replacing my brother's room, and it stayed alive normally. From then on, I've never felt a presence near me when I was home and alone. All game show sounds and footsteps has ceased, for now. I want to astral project eventually, but at least now I'm wary and will try to control the fear they give me for the faithful weak.
I am a 51-year-old Chinese American transgender woman who was born in Pennsylvania, but moved to Arizona in my 20s and lived there for 5 years, moving back east after these experiences. I don't believe in the paranormal or magic or even ghosts, but after living in Arizona, I do believe in skinwalkers. I don't know if one was following me or if I just happened to be unlucky enough to encounter multiple of them. I just know that weird things happened, and skinwalkers were all I could find that made sense. And I know that I will never set foot in Arizona again. I am not a Native American, so I don't know if skinwalker is even truly the right thing I've encountered. But anyone who has different ideas, please let me know. First encounter. This was the first week that I lived in Santa Cruz County. I rented a small house for my first place. I would come to move a lot, actually. Nobody here knew anything about me. For all they knew, I was just a normal girl with no secrets. I have had a great deal of work done. Yes, including SRS, but I have been told it looks very natural, except for my lips, which are very distinctly misshapen from some blotched lip fillers I had in the past. Nobody I met in Arizona knew I was transgender at the time. I do not speak to my traditional Chinese parents anymore, and have not seen them since I was 15. My sister came to visit me frequently though. One night at my house, my sister had come over and we were talking on the porch as she was smoking a cigarette. She had talked to me about her father wanting to see pictures of me, and how she had refused. He does not accept my transition, and while he is on good terms with her, she refuses to share my life with him, since he does not want to be a part of it anyway. However, sometimes he makes attempts. She was mocking his voice to try and make me laugh, repeating in Mandarin what essentially translated to, "I want to see his picture," while pointing to me. It was something he did every single time he called me a man, even in casual conversations, as if that could convince me that I was a man. We laughed about it and continued talking. After she left my house to head to the airport, it was starting to get dark when I heard knocking on the back door to the porch. My sister was there even after leaving only 2 hours ago. Without her car in front, by the way. She was holding a pack of Marlboros with a cigarette in her mouth, just standing at the door. My sister is known to only smoke Camels. I opened it up, but I stood inside, assuming she obviously would come in, but
She stood there. We made eye contact and I got goosebumps for unknown reasons. She looked tired in a way that I hadn't seen since she first had my nephew. She said in Chinese, "I want to see his picture," and pointed to me. Her verse was slurred, like she was drunk. When I looked at her hand, just because when someone gestures I tend to follow it, I noticed her feet were horribly disfigured. She repeated the Mandarin again, but this time her words were wrong. Like how when you are teaching an English speaker how to say something, and they repeat it with stress on the incorrect sounds. I felt very confused, but after an evening of drinking, note that at this time in my life I was not yet an alcoholic. I was only a casual drinker who could get tipsy off just 1 or 2 drinks. I became an alcoholic after the encounters had started, but I am over 20 years sober. I honestly assumed I was just having a weird dream. It felt like real life, and I had been watching TV before the knock, but the way her feet looked, I knew it wasn't real. I closed the door and walked back to bed. I woke up in my clothes and hairstyle from the night before, which is very unusual for me. I make it a point to braid my hair before bed and to change into one of my silk night dresses. Immediately, a chill ran up my spine, and I quickly called my sister, who had gotten an earlier flight home because the pilot of her original flight had become ill, and they had a whole ordeal at the airport of people switching flights and tickets with the airline or other passengers. She had my nephew's baseball game that next day, so a woman exchanged her ticket for my sister's for the next day. Instead of waiting at the airport, she actually got on a plane an hour early than her original. I had not fallen asleep after she left, and it was clear I only had gone to bed after closing the door. As a non-believer, but someone who enjoys listening to scary stories on the radio or television, I was creeped out, but figured I had to have been seeing things because she was definitely not at my house. I made a habit of locking the porch door, and it actually inspired me to stop smoking cigarettes myself. A few years later, when I became aware that it was a skinwalker, I could no longer think of smoking the same way. I did not quit cold turkey. Second encounter. I was out drinking all night at a bar, and had originally planned for only another drink or 2 before my friend would come and pick me up to drive me home. But this very handsome man named David sat down and started hitting on me. He was very charming and funny. I had a very good time. He asked if I would go home to sleep with him, and I politely declined because I'm not that kind of girl. Being someone who is transgender and prefers to stay private about that, even after SRS, I still make sure to disclose my birth sex to any man I'm dating or sleeping with. Only knowing him for a few hours, especially as I was drunk, and I didn't know his opinion on transgenders, of course I wasn't going to tell him. He said he understood and asked me if I felt comfortable with his friend, who was a waitress at the bar, driving me home. I said sure and called my friend, saying I wouldn't need a ride. We drank and talked, and the woman was done with her shift. He walked me to the door and kissed my hand, asking me to call him later for another date. I felt like a princess that night and slept like a baby. I didn't call him that day because I was going to go by the 3-day rule. I don't know if girls these days still do it, but when I was a young sprout, we would wait 3 days before calling back a suitor with the idea of leaving him waiting for you to call, so he will be excited to hear from you. Anyway, that whole day I was thinking about him. He was definitely a dreamboat. That night at 6 p.m. I heard pounding on the door. It was David. He was just standing there with a facial expression that seemed like he was on drugs, beating in the door with both fists with no car in the driveway or out front. I was scared that it was because I hadn't called him back immediately, so I called the police, and as soon as I started talking on the phone, his head turned sharply. It looked like it hurt. He looked me in the eyes from the window, never stopping the slamming, and for some reason, all I can think of was my sister a few months prior, and I felt goosebumps again. I also thought his nose looked different than when I sat one bar stool away from him. But then again, I was really drunk when I saw him, so maybe I was wrong. It looked much bigger than I remembered, and it was really red and swollen, with a trail of blood coming from both nostrils. But the blood looked weird too. I can't explain how it looked weird, but above my door had a light that I turned on to see who it was, and under the light, it didn't shine red. I told the police that a man I met at a bar last night was violently knocking on my door in a way that seemed like he wanted to hurt me. They said a cop was coming and to stay on the line. I asked how long it would take, and he, the Skinwalker I thought was David, closed his eyes, like squeezing them shut. I will never forget the way his hands immediately froze mid-motion, hovering in front of the door, just about to hit it. All of a sudden, he turned around and walked away, just walking in a straight line down the street. He wasn't in a hurry, and he walked with a limp. I didn't notice that at the bar. It was like he heard that the police were coming and decided to give up. I told the person on the phone and stayed on the line, hiding in my kitchen until the officer arrived. He looked annoyed and said if David came back to call again. I did not file a police report against him. The officer asked, and I did not want to because I was scared that he would find out and come back. I just wanted it to be all over. I have PTSD from being beaten by men for being transgender when I was younger before. 1 week later, I saw David again walking in town, and he smiled at me, walking over to say hello, with a happy expression on his face. He looked how I remembered him from the bar, not from my house, but I was still scared. I started crying and I told him to stay away from me, very loudly, and he looked confused and hurt, but he apologized and walked away quickly. No limp. He was a polite person at the bar and out in the town. Even just him saying my name, I felt the same way I did in the bar, and if it had not been for the way what I now think was a skinwalker had behaved at my house, I would have gladly talked to him. After I found out about skinwalkers, I wanted to call his phone number, even if it was crazy, but I wanted to explain why I screamed at him the day we met in town. Even after screaming at him all those years ago, and sometimes still now, I get the feeling that he truly was the one who got away. After seeing David again, I was worried he would come back to the house. At this point, I wouldn't let him learn about skinwalkers for another few weeks, so I decided I should get a dog. My landlord said he wouldn't allow one, so I waited until I moved houses. I moved to Pima County, not far from Tucson. I adopted a pit bull because, even though I don't believe the stereotypes about them, I hoped David would if he ever came around again. His name was Fang, but I called him Fango Mango for the first few days I had him, just as a silly nickname, and eventually I changed his name to just Mango because he was the sweetest dog ever, and he started responding to it over Fang. He was abused by his previous owners and was part of a dog fighting company as a puppy. He had a giant part of his left ear missing. Even seeing himself in a mirror made him scared. He was scared of other dogs and of men. He made me feel a lot safer and happier. One night he wanted to go out to go pee, so I let him out while I got myself a cup of water. All of a sudden I heard growling and whimpering, like he saw another dog and was scared it would attack him. I go to look out the window, and he was whimpering in the middle of the yard, and the other dog was out of the view of the window. I had heard how he cries around the other dog before, and it sounded different this time, so I thought he might have been hurt. Usually when he got scared, he would close his eyes with his paws, but in the yard his eyes were open, looking at the door, and his head was up, not wherever this other dog was. I ran to the door and opened it, calling his name, and he started running at me. All of a sudden, Mango ran into my legs while I was watching him running, still 10 to 15 feet from the door. I slammed it shut on impulse, not even processing what was happening. And then, the dog that had been running actually ran headfirst into the door. Mango stood in front of me, between me and the door, growling. I had never heard him growl before. I ran to the window, but he stood at the door scratching at it, like he wanted to get out and kill the other dog. He scratched so hard that it actually left marks in the door. The other dog turned and ran away when I noticed something crazy. The piece of missing ear was now on the right, not the left, and his tail looked like it was stung by tons of bees. That next day, I went to the supermarket and bought a steak for Mango as a reward for being my fierce protector from the other dog. I've been a vegetarian since I was 12, so I pretty much cooked it to hell and back, but when I gave him the cut up pieces, he didn't seem to mind the burnt parts. The other dog had scratched the door too, but his claw marks looked nowhere similar to the ones inside that the real Mango had made. My landlord made me pay for a new door, which was fine by me. I eventually moved because he would make crude comments about me. Fourth encounter. This is the first encounter that actually made me feel like there was a connection to the previous events. The blank and unexpressive eyes. The weird way the one that spoke, the one who whimpered, sounds so real at first, but when I listened again, they came out wrong in a way. The weird differences, up to this point, the feet, the nose, and the ear and tail, and the fact that they were all around the same window of time at night. Anyway, this time I was taking Mango for a walk in the evening, and even though it was light outside, it got dark pretty quickly. I still lived in the county I was, and only a few streets away from my old place. This new house didn't have a yard, so I walked him multiple times per day, every day. He was a pretty old dog when I got him. At this time, he would have been around 11. I heard my name being called by my neighbor or so I turned to see where she was to say hello. She sounded like she had a lisp when she pronounces the S, which she normally didn't have, but I couldn't see her. From the same direction, out of the bushes, a desert coyote bolted at me. Mango jumped in front of me and growled, grabbing it by its body and its mouth and slamming it to the ground. He had never growled around me before, the time where the Skinwalker looked like him, and up until this point, it was still the only time he had growled. It wiggled out of his teeth and there was no blood on it. The fur was barely even disturbed. Its muzzle looked too big for its face, like someone had drawn it out of proportion. The tail was bent weird as hell, almost like it had been broken in multiple places. It clearly wasn't an animal in its right mind because, instead of running away, it immediately turned back and attacked Mango. I tried to pull the coyote off of him. The coyote felt cold to the touch, despite the warm night, and it bit me on the arm, very deeply. I still have the faint scar to this day. The pain was like nothing I have ever felt. It felt like my entire arm was on fire, and the actual bite mark was visually pulsing. Even after being viciously attacked and actively being attacked, Mango still continued to try and fight off the coyote. I felt like I was going to pass out. I was so nauseous, and I fell to the ground because everything was spinning, but willed myself to stay awake to help my dog. Mango bit the coyote on the face or the neck, and it screamed like a human man would, not like any of the injured coyote noises I've ever heard online. It ran away and I watched it. Before it left, it turned around and stared at me in the eyes, and showed me its teeth in a way that it looked like it was smiling at me. Once again, it felt like all those other times and my skin crawled. I picked Mango up in my arms and cried over him. Even in his pain, he licked my face. His beautiful gingerbread fur was soaked in blood and coyote bites, and he not only threw up onto me, but he just started pooping and peeing all over, uncontrollably, because he started having seizures. By the time animal control had come with an emergency vet, he died. I went to the hospital because of my bite and I had to get 13 stitches. In the hospital waiting room, I actually had my first seizure ever. I had them extremely often the rest of the time I lived in Arizona, and I haven't had a single one since I left and never went back. The wound didn't heal for weeks and got infected multiple times. The coyote was not rabid because neither of us had any evidence of rabies or other illnesses that coyotes carry. Losing Mango sent me into a deep depression, and I went to a therapist to deal with the grief. She had me involuntarily hospitalized, where I was diagnosed with PTSD, as well as a schizophrenic because I told them all about the encounters and said the coyotes was a demon who was trying to make me suffer. After living in the psychiatric ward for nearly 2 months, I was discharged and I got a tattoo of mango fruit to cover the coyote bite scar. Not many people that I knew, especially women, had tattoos, but I was proud of it. The day my friend came to pick me up from the hospital, we saw a coyote alone. I called the landlord when I was hospitalized, and after I got out, he actually helped me and my friends move all of my stuff. I never went back and even left the county. I was not a religious woman by any means, but the only thing I could think of at the time was that a demon was tormenting me. I should also mention that a man who I was dating at the time found a heavily mutilated and half-decayed coyote corpse in the front of his apartment one month into my stay at the hospital, and he broke up with me over the phone because he thought if I was crazy enough to be in a mental hospital, my friends were probably crazy enough to do something like that to him, and he made a lot of bad remarks about me trying to turn him gay. Fifth encounter. I had moved to a town between Florence and Globe and just wanted to start over. I was having really bad side effects from the medicine, but my outpatient psychiatrist said to not stop taking it. This was 3 months after leaving the hospital that my tattoo bite area started to feel like it was burning. Not all the time, but sometimes. Usually at night and almost always before I had a seizure. This is another strange thing that happened the rest of the time that I lived in Arizona that also hasn't happened since I moved away. In my new apartment, I had a cat named Slinky. One day, Slinky went missing while I was at work, and I started asking around if anyone had seen her, because I lived on the 4th floor and never let her out. So even if she left my apartment, someone had to take her somewhere to not be on the floor. One of my neighbors told me that she helped my boyfriend take her as per my request, and she looked horrified that I asked her if she saw my missing cat. I didn't even have a boyfriend and clearly didn't have my non-existent boyfriend go take her so I could ask her to describe him. She said a Native American or possibly Mexican man saw her in the hallway and walked up to her with an empty cat carrier and asked if she could call the building manager for him, because I asked him to take Slinky to the vet for me, but he forgot his key. Coincidentally, or maybe he knew this, she was the neighbor I had started to become good friends with, and she made my spare key. She let him in, but he got a call on his phone before he went in. He asked her to get Slinky for him, claiming that Slinky was scared of him and went into the stairwell to talk on the phone. Once my neighbor had put Slinky in the carrier, the man left. That night, my bite burned so bad I had a seizure in my bed. When I checked the mail the following day, I had an envelope with just my first name written on it, and nothing else. The only thing that was inside was Slinky's fur, as if someone had used electric hair clippers to shave it off. I felt like a paranoid racist, but I went to the library to research Native American curses and weird experiences, eventually coming across Skinwalkers. A few days later at work, I saw a cat in the parking lot next to my car that looked exactly like Slinky, besides the weird shaped tail, and obviously if it was Slinky, her hair would be all shaved off. But it wasn't. It started walking towards me, but I got in my car and tried to run it over. Not something I'm proud of, even if it was a skinwalker. I swerved at the last second because I couldn't bring myself to actually kill it. I can't say if this is an encounter for sure, but a few days after this, a large hawk was pecking at my window for over 2 hours and only left after it started raining. I say I don't know because I didn't see anything weird about it. Slinky was the last pet that I owned. The last encounter. I was living in Bylis when a woman grabbed my arm. The one I was bit on. While walking down the street, actually. She looked like she had a stroke or something because half of her face had been drooping very, very noticeably. She had the same blank eyes I now associated with what I assumed were skinwalkers. Gave me the same goosebumps too. My skin was in searing pain, where she was holding me, and in a voice that sounded almost like a messed up recording, she said my birth name. I pulled away and my skin was red, and the shape of her hand. I asked her why she was tormenting me for all of these years, and she just repeated the name my parents gave me at birth. This time, with the last name that I also had changed and not told anyone. This woman had found my old real name. Even after disclosing I am transgender and I never ever give out my old real name, let alone the entirety of it. I told her to just kill me and get it over with, because by this point, I didn't want to live with the fear and paranoia and suffering anymore. She opened her mouth like she was going to say something, but nothing came out when she moved her lips. I ran towards my car and drove away. I decided that day I needed to move before I was killed by this thing, so my sister flew out to get me, and I packed everything up to move in with her for just a few months on the East Coast. She said outside of the Safford Regional Airport while she was smoking, she saw a woman who looked exactly like me, besides her lips, and she looked like she was wearing men's clothes. Everything else exactly the same. I believe it wanted to kill my sister. I stopped taking medication a few years later. After it was confirmed I was misdiagnosed as a schizophrenic, they put a sticky note in my file at my therapist's office that the reason for hospitalization was a psychosis episode that was mistaken for schizophrenia. This is what my therapist said she would do. I genuinely believe I had a skinwalker tormenting me, if not the same one, then a group of them. I have a fear of animals, and am very prone to staring new people I meet in the eyes, in case they might be a skinwalker. I don't go out at night, and for a few years, I became a severe alcoholic. I now have liver cancer, but my wonderful man has supported me in sobriety and treatment. He doesn't care that I might be cursed by evil creatures, because he loves me, but every day I live in paranoia that one day the skinwalker will decide to leave Arizona to come find me and kill him, or our teenage adopted daughters. I also believe the only reason I was not killed is because it had some intent to harass me, and that by saying I wanted to die, I would be the winner if it had killed me. I think the natives have been here long before us, and they know the kind of evil this country holds in its bones. I hope that even if you kind people cannot offer me a possible explanation for what has happened in my past, you can at least find entertainment in what I've told you. Sometimes I find it ironic that, despite not believing in ghosts, some of my favorite ghost stories are the ones that claim to be real events. I would appreciate any information anyone could give me, as well as anyone who might know why it targeted me. Thank you for everyone to take the time to listen to this.